Brest Harbor, occupied France, March 1943. German naval engineers inspect a freshly repaired U-boat preparing for its Atlantic patrol. Everything checks out perfectly. The hull is sound, the engines purr, the torpedo tubes are loaded. The submarine slips beneath the waves and disappears into the depths. 3 weeks later, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, the U-boat simply vanishes. No distress signal, no debris field, no survivors. The Kriegsmarine lists it as lost to unknown causes, perhaps a depth charge, perhaps a mine. They never suspect the truth. Hidden deep in the submarine's ballast tank, placed there months earlier during a previous repair cycle, a small device has been counting down, not with gears or wires, but with chemistry. A copper tube slowly corroding, a spring under tension, waiting. And when that tube finally dissolved completely, a firing pin slams home into a detonator, triggering enough explosive to rip the submarine apart from the inside. The crew never knew what hit them, the Germans never found the evidence, and the British never claimed credit. This wasn't sabotage as the Germans understood it. This was something far more patient, far more insidious. The SOE called them time delay mechanisms, but that clinical term doesn't capture their brilliance. These were sleeper explosives, bombs that could wait weeks, months, even years before detonating. They turned repaired equipment into ticking time bombs. They made every German factory worker a potential saboteur without their knowledge. And they drove Nazi security forces absolutely mad trying to find threats that had been planted before anyone knew to look. But how do you build a bomb that waits months to explode? And why would you even want to? By 1942, the Special Operations Executive faced a strategic problem. Immediate sabotage had its place. Blow up a bridge, derail a train, assassinate a collaborator. But these attacks were obvious. They prompted immediate responses: increased security, mass arrests, brutal reprisals against civilian populations. The SOE needed something subtler, something that would cause chaos without revealing when or how the sabotage occurred. The answer lay in time itself. What if an explosive device could be planted during a moment of access, then remain dormant for weeks or months? A factory worker could slip it into a machine. A dock worker could hide it in a ship's cargo hold. A railway employee could attach it to a locomotive. By the time the device detonated, the saboteur would be long gone, beyond suspicion, perhaps in another country entirely. There would be no connection between the act of placement and the moment of destruction. But creating a reliable long-delay explosive mechanism was extraordinarily difficult. Mechanical clockwork devices couldn't run for months without maintenance. Electrical timers required batteries that would discharge long before detonation. Chemical fuses were unpredictable over extended periods. The engineers at Station 9 needed to invent something entirely new, a timing mechanism that required no power source, remained stable through temperature extremes and rough handling, and would reliably trigger after a predetermined delay ranging from days to months. The solution they developed was deceptively simple: controlled corrosion. A copper wire or tube holding back a spring-loaded firing pin, an acid or corrosive solution slowly eating through the metal. When the copper finally dissolved completely, the spring released, the firing pin struck, and the explosive detonated. No gears, no batteries, just chemistry and patience. The British called them time pencils when they were small and portable, or L-delays for larger installations. The Germans, when they finally discovered them, had a different name: Teufelswerk, the devil's work. How could something so simple become one of the most effective sabotage tools of World War II? Let me show you the brilliance and the horror of these patient killers. The genius of the L-delay mechanism lay in its simplicity. At its core was a glass ampule filled with copper chloride, a corrosive chemical solution. This ampule was crushed when the device was activated, releasing the solution onto a thin copper wire. The acid immediately began eating through the wire. When the copper finally dissolved completely, it released a spring under tension. That spring drove a striker into a percussion cap, which ignited a small charge that triggered the main explosive. The delay time depended on 3 factors: the concentration of the copper chloride, the thickness of the copper wire, and the ambient temperature. Station 9 engineers developed standardized versions with delays ranging from 10 minutes to 6 months. Each version was color-coded: black for short delays, red for medium, green for long. A green time pencil might take 90 days to function. A red one might trigger after 30 days. Black meant hours or days at most. But temperature was the wild card. Chemical reactions accelerate in heat and slow in cold. A device calibrated for 30 days in temperate conditions might detonate in 20 days in tropical heat or 45 days in Arctic cold. SOE training emphasized this limitation. Agents learned to estimate local temperature conditions and adjust their planning accordingly. A device planted in a ship's hot engine room would trigger faster than one hidden in a frozen Norwegian warehouse. The physical design evolved through multiple iterations. Early versions were cylindrical tubes about the size of a thick pencil, hence the name time pencil. Later designs became more compact and could be hidden inside machinery, structural supports, or cargo. The explosive charge itself was usually plastic explosive, malleable, stable, and powerful. A typical device might contain 2 to 4 ounces of explosive, enough to destroy a machine, rupture a fuel tank, or disable a vehicle. Station 9 developed specialized variants for specific targets. Ship-sinking delays included waterproof housings and magnetic clamps for attachment to steel hulls below the waterline. Railway versions had brackets for mounting to locomotive frames or beneath rail cars. Industrial sabotage kits included multiple small devices that could be distributed throughout a factory, creating simultaneous failures weeks after placement that would appear to be equipment malfunction rather than sabotage. The brilliance extended to the explosive effects. These weren't designed for maximum destructive power, they were calibrated for maximum disruption. A device in an engine might crack the cylinder block, requiring complete replacement. One placed in a gearbox would shatter precision components impossible to manufacture quickly. The goal wasn't spectacular explosions, but crippling damage that would take months to repair. You won't believe how these simple devices, each costing less than £5 to manufacture, would go on to destroy millions of pounds worth of German equipment and completely reshape Nazi security doctrine. Manufacturing delay devices required precision despite their apparent simplicity. The copper chloride concentration had to be exact. Too weak and the delay would be unpredictably long. Too strong and the wire might corrode too quickly. The copper wire diameter was measured to within thousandths of an inch. Even slight variations could throw off the timing by days or weeks. Station 9 maintained strict quality control, testing random samples from each production batch to verify their delay characteristics. Production ramped up dramatically throughout 1942 and 1943. Initially, Station 9 produced perhaps 100 devices per month. By 1944, multiple facilities were manufacturing thousands. The devices were simple enough that semi-skilled workers could assemble them under supervision, though only trusted personnel with security clearances had access to the complete assembly process. The corrosive solutions were mixed at one location, the firing mechanisms assembled at another. Final integration occurred at Station 9 itself. Security around these devices was absolute. Each batch was assigned a serial number that tracked it from manufacture through distribution to eventual deployment, though of course, once detonated, there would be no serial number to recover. Training manuals were classified above top secret. Only SOE agents bound for field operations learned about delay mechanisms, and even then, they received only the information necessary for their specific missions. Distribution to occupied Europe happened through the same channels as other SOE equipment: night parachute drops, submarine landings, and dead drops in neutral countries. But delay devices presented unique challenges. They were fragile. Rough handling could break the glass ampule prematurely, either deactivating the device or triggering it immediately. Special packaging was developed, shock-absorbing cases that could survive parachute drops or rough sea landings. Each device came with detailed activation instructions printed on rice paper that could be eaten if capture threatened. The SOE also trained resistance networks in occupied territories to deploy the devices without direct British involvement. French, Norwegian, Danish, and Dutch resistance fighters received shipments of delays along with target lists and operational guidance. This distributed approach multiplied the effectiveness. Dozens or even hundreds of attacks could be staged simultaneously across occupied Europe, all timed to create maximum confusion and disruption. But theoretical capability meant nothing until tested in the field. How would these patient bombs perform when real agents placed them in real Nazi facilities? The answer would exceed even Churchill's wildest hopes. The first major success came in occupied Denmark, winter of 1942. Danish resistance fighters received 20 delay devices with 60-day timing mechanisms. Their targets? Locomotives in the marshalling yards at Aarhus, a critical junction for German rail traffic moving between Germany and Norway. Over 3 weeks, railway workers sympathetic to the resistance attached the devices to locomotive frames, tucked them into maintenance hatches, and hid them beneath coal bunkers. The workers then went about their normal duties. Christmas came and went. The New Year arrived. Guards saw nothing suspicious. Then, in late February, the locomotives began failing. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. One locomotive's drive shaft shattered. 2 days later, another engine's gearbox exploded. A week after that, a third locomotive's boiler cracked. The Germans investigated each failure as a maintenance issue. They found sabotaged components, but no evidence of recent tampering. Security logs showed no unauthorized access. The locomotives had been inspected regularly. How could saboteurs plant explosives that evaded discovery for 2 months? The Gestapo arrested railway workers anyway, torturing dozens to extract confessions that never came because the workers genuinely didn't know they'd been carrying time bombs. The paranoia spread. Every mechanical failure became suspect. German efficiency ground to a halt as engineers conducted obsessive inspections of every vehicle, every machine, every piece of equipment. And still, the mysterious failures continued. In France, the resistance used delays against German supply dumps. A fighter posing as a truck driver delivered supplies to a Wehrmacht warehouse outside Lyon. Hidden in crates of boots and uniforms were half a dozen delay devices set for 90 days. 3 months later, in the middle of a quiet spring night, the warehouse erupted. Fire spread through stored supplies, destroying thousands of uniforms, boots, tents, and field equipment. By the time firefighters arrived, the damage was catastrophic. The Germans investigated the driver who'd made the delivery, but he'd since been transferred to another region. They found no evidence of recent intrusion. The case went unsolved. The most audacious operation targeted German U-boats. SOE agents working with French resistance cells in Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, major U-boat bases, managed to plant delays in submarines undergoing repair. The devices were hidden in ballast tanks, tucked behind electrical panels, secured to hull frames in rarely inspected sections. The delays were set for 30 to 60 days, ensuring the submarines would be at sea when detonation occurred. Over the course of 1943, at least 7 U-boats disappeared without explanation in the Atlantic. The Germans attributed these losses to depth charges or mines, standard operational hazards. They never suspected that some of these submarines had been destroyed by bombs planted weeks earlier while docked in French ports. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. If your submarine could simply explode randomly at sea, nowhere was safe. Morale plummeted. Little did the Germans realize the British were about to launch their most elaborate delay operation yet, one that would cripple an entire industrial sector for months. In early 1944, as Allied invasion plans solidified, the SOE launched Operation Bradock, a coordinated campaign using hundreds of delay devices across occupied France to disrupt German logistics in the months leading up to D-Day. The goal wasn't immediate destruction, but cascading failures that would appear organic, avoiding the mass reprisals that usually followed obvious sabotage. Resistance networks received shipments of over 500 delay devices with varying timing mechanisms. Some were set for 2 weeks, others for 2 months. The The staggered delays meant that German forces would face a continuous stream of equipment failures impossible to predict or prevent. Target lists were extensive: railway equipment, military vehicles, factory machinery, power stations, communication equipment, and fuel storage facilities. The placement phase took 6 weeks. Thousands of resistance fighters, factory workers, railway employees, and dock workers participated, most without knowing exactly what they were planting. A factory worker might slip a small device into a machine's oil reservoir. A truck driver could attach one beneath a military vehicle's chassis. A power station employee might hide one in a transformer housing. Each person completed their small part, then resumed normal life. The results began appearing in March 1944 and continued through June. German locomotives suffered mysterious mechanical failures at 3 times the normal rate. Factory production lines shut down as precision machinery inexplicably broke. Military trucks and half-tracks experienced catastrophic engine failures. Fuel depots caught fire from unknown ignition sources. Power stations suffered transformer explosions. Communication lines went dead as relay equipment failed. The Germans recognized they were under attack but couldn't determine how. Mechanical inspections found sabotaged components but no suspects. Security had been tight throughout the period when the devices must have been planted. The paranoia became paralyzing. German commanders stopped trusting their own equipment. Extra inspections caused delays. Replacement parts couldn't keep pace with failures, and still the mysterious breakdowns continued. By D-Day, German logistics in occupied France were in chaos. Units couldn't move efficiently because locomotives were unreliable. Reinforcements were delayed because trucks kept breaking down. Communication between commands was sporadic because relay stations had failed. The Wehrmacht was fighting blind, immobile, and increasingly demoralized. Historians estimate that Operation Bradock's Delay campaign reduced German operational mobility in France by 30 to 40% during the critical weeks after the invasion. And the beautiful horror of it all? The Germans never fully understood what had happened. Even after the war, many German officers believed they'd been defeated partly by inexplicable equipment failures, perhaps manufacturing sabotage, perhaps bad luck. They never realized they'd been systematically destroyed by bombs that waited months to strike. The German response to Delay attacks evolved from confusion to paranoia to desperation. Initially, they treated mechanical failures as routine maintenance issues, but as the pattern became undeniable, the Abwehr and Gestapo launched massive investigations. They brought in explosives experts, metallurgists, and chemists to analyze sabotaged components. Eventually, they recovered enough evidence to understand the basic principle: time-delayed chemical detonators. Once they knew what they were facing, the Germans implemented draconian security measures. All equipment entering service had to be completely disassembled and inspected. Unscheduled random inspections became routine. Guards were posted on every piece of valuable machinery around the clock. Workers faced multiple searches before and after shifts. Anyone with access to equipment became a suspect. The measures were comprehensive, expensive, and largely futile. The problem was fundamental. You can't inspect for a threat that was planted weeks or months ago. A submarine inspected thoroughly before departure might still carry a device installed during its last repair cycle. A factory machine stripped down today might have a time pencil placed in its oil reservoir last month. The delays meant the causal chain was severed. There was no temporal connection between placement and detonation to investigate. German engineers tried to develop detection methods. They experimented with X-ray equipment to scan machinery for hidden devices, but the technology was too primitive and too slow for mass screening. They proposed chemical tests to detect copper chloride residue, but these required knowing exactly where to test, impossible when a single factory might have thousands of potential hiding spots. Some facilities implemented burn-in periods where new equipment ran under observation for weeks before deployment, but this just delayed production without guaranteeing safety. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers and workers lived in constant fear. Every piece of equipment might explode. Every machine might be sabotaged. Every vehicle could fail catastrophically at any moment. Maintenance crews refused to work alone, fearing they'd be blamed when time bombs inevitably detonated. Officers hesitated to use equipment even when operationally necessary because they couldn't trust it. The fear became its own weapon. The SS implemented brutal reprisal policies. When delay sabotage was confirmed, they arrested everyone who'd had access to the equipment during the preceding 6 months. Interrogations were savage. Innocent workers were tortured and executed because the Germans refused to accept that their security could be so thoroughly compromised. These atrocities only strengthened resistance movements. Every unjust execution created a dozen new fighters willing to risk everything against the occupiers. By late 1944, German internal security reports showed that delay attacks had created a crisis of confidence in Nazi-controlled equipment and infrastructure. The reports are chilling reading. Officers requesting reassignment from occupied territories, factory managers reporting that workers were too fearful to operate machinery, logistics commanders declaring certain equipment categories unreliable. The British had weaponized doubt itself. Despite their effectiveness, delay devices had significant limitations that Station 9 engineers continuously worked to overcome. Temperature sensitivity remained the primary challenge. A device calibrated for 30 days at 20 degrees Celsius might detonate after 20 days in 40-degree heat or 45 days in sub-zero cold. SOE training emphasized this variability, but agents in the field couldn't always predict the conditions a device would experience over weeks or months. Station 9 developed temperature-compensated mechanisms, but these were more complex and less reliable. Some versions used bimetallic strips that adjusted the corrosion rate based on temperature. Others employed wax-based expansion chambers that modified the chemical concentration as temperature changed. These sophisticated versions worked better, but were more expensive to produce and more prone to mechanical failure. The simple copper wire and acid design remained the workhorse despite its limitations. Another challenge was premature activation due to rough handling. The glass ampoules containing copper chloride were fragile. If broken during transport or placement, the device would either activate immediately or fail completely, depending on how the ampoules shattered. Special shock-resistant designs were developed, but they increased the device size and made concealment more difficult. Agents had to choose between ruggedness and concealability. Reliability was also imperfect. Station 9's testing showed that approximately 95% of devices functioned within 20% of their intended delay time. That meant 5% failed entirely, either detonating far too early, far too late, or not at all. For sabotage operations, this was acceptable, but it meant that not every planted device would achieve its mission. SOE doctrine called for deploying multiple devices whenever possible to ensure at least some would function as intended. The explosive yield was another limitation. delay devices were small and portable, which meant they carried limited explosive charges. They could destroy individual pieces of equipment or create localized damage, but they couldn't demolish buildings or obliterate large targets like conventional bombs could. Their power lay in cumulative effect and strategic targeting rather than raw destructive force. A dozen small explosions disabling critical machinery was more valuable than one large explosion that merely damaged a building. Engineers experimented with combining delays with larger conventional explosives. A small delay device would serve as the detonator for a much larger charge assembled on-site from locally sourced materials. This approach worked well for demolition operations, but required more preparation and increased the risk of discovery. Most successful delay operations relied on the devices themselves as both timer and explosive charge. Station 9 also developed specialized variants for specific environments. Waterproof versions for maritime sabotage, heat-resistant models for use in engine compartments or boiler rooms, vibration-dampened types for railway applications where constant shaking might damage standard mechanisms. Each variant required separate testing and production protocols, but the diversity allowed agents to select the optimal tool for each mission. By the war's end, Station 9 had produced over 50 distinct delay variants with different delay times, explosive yields, environmental protections, and concealment options. This variety was itself a strategic advantage. German countermeasures that might detect one variant would miss others. The variety also confused intelligence efforts. Captured devices might reveal British capabilities, but the Germans never knew if they were seeing the full range or just a small sample. The statistical impact of delay operations during World War II is difficult to quantify precisely because so many attacks were never identified as sabotage. German records classified many delay destructions as equipment failures, accidents, or unexplained losses. Post-war analysis by military historians estimates that delay devices destroyed or disabled approximately 800 locomotives, over 2,000 military vehicles, at least a dozen ships and submarines, hundreds of pieces of factory equipment, and countless smaller assets. The economic damage exceeded £100 million, an astronomical return on investment for weapons that cost pounds to manufacture. But the numbers don't capture the strategic significance. delay operations achieved effects far beyond physical destruction. They forced the Germans to divert massive resources to security measures. They slowed production and logistics across occupied Europe. They created a climate of fear and mistrust that corroded German efficiency. They demonstrated to resistance movements that patient, strategic sabotage could be more effective than immediate violence. And they pioneered a form of warfare, time-delayed, deniable sabotage, that intelligence services continue to employ today. The technology itself survived the war. Modern improvised explosive devices frequently use time delay mechanisms descended from British delay principles. Electronic timers have replaced chemical corrosion in most applications, but the strategic logic remains identical. Plant the device during a moment of access, then detonate it later when detection is impossible and attribution is ambiguous. Counterterrorism experts still grapple with the challenge that vexed the Gestapo. How do you defend against threats planted before anyone knew to look? The psychological warfare aspect proved particularly influential. Delays demonstrated that the fear of attack could be as debilitating as actual attacks. If the enemy cannot trust their own equipment, they become paralyzed by doubt. This principle influenced Cold War intelligence operations, where both sides sought to undermine the other's confidence in their weapons, communications, and infrastructure. The fear itself became the weapon. For the SOE agents and resistance fighters who deployed these devices, recognition came slowly, if at all. Most delay operations remained classified for decades after World War II. Many participants died without knowing the full scope of damage they'd inflicted or the strategic impact of their courage. The French railway worker who hid a time pencil in a locomotive, the Norwegian dockhand who planted one in a German ship, the Danish factory employee who tucked one into a machine, these anonymous heroes changed the course of history with acts of patient defiance. The delay stands as testament to British ingenuity in asymmetric warfare. When you cannot match the enemy's industrial might or military strength, you change the rules. You turn time itself into a weapon. You make patience more powerful than firepower. You transform everyday workers into strategic assets, and you prove that sometimes the most devastating attacks are the ones the enemy doesn't realize are attacks until it's far too late. The brilliance of the British delay wasn't its explosive power, it was its patience. In a war defined by immediate violence, these devices played a longer game. They waited, they lurked, they struck when least expected and most devastating. They turned the Germans' own infrastructure against them and made every repair, every inspection, every deployment an act of faith in equipment that might betray them at any moment. That's not just sabotage, that's psychological warfare of the highest order. The next time you hear about a mysterious equipment failure or an unexplained explosion, consider that somewhere in history there might be a time delay device waiting patiently to fulfill its mission months or years after placement. That's the true legacy of Station 9's sleeper explosives, the reminder that in warfare, patience can be the deadliest weapon of all. Time, when weaponized, becomes an invisible enemy that no army can defeat. If this story of patient destruction fascinated you, you absolutely must watch our previous videos on the well-rod pistol, the suppressed assassin that let British agents kill Nazi officers in complete silence, and the thermite incendiary devices that turned German ammunition dumps into infernos hot enough to melt steel. These weapons shared the L-Delay's genius. They were simple, devastating, and absolutely terrifying to the enemy. Don't miss those incredible stories of British innovation in the shadows of World War II. And if you want to discover more deadly ingenious gadgets that won the war through cunning rather than firepower, subscribe to this channel right now. We're uncovering the secret weapons history forgot, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we reveal the brilliant, terrifying tools that helped defeat the Third Reich.